Hello, and welcome to this first lecture on this new section on regulatory compliance in the course on how to become an excellent HR generalist. So, in this new section, we will give you some in-depth understanding of how to comply with the regulatory requirements related to HR and become an excellent HR generalist and build a great career in HR. In this module, we're going to talk about three things. One, what do we mean by regulatory compliance? What are the regulatory requirements to comply with? Some examples of that, and what can you do as an HR generalist to comply with regulatory requirements? In this particular lecture, we'll talk about the first two things. What do we mean by regulatory compliance, and what are the regulatory requirements to comply with? And in the next section, we'll talk about what can you do as an HR generalist. So, what your thoughts on what do we mean by regulatory compliance? What is your understanding of what is regulatory compliance? See, the regulatory compliance basically means meeting the laws of the land, and it involves basically three things. So, one, in terms of governance, in terms of someone to guide, which will be your bosses, your HR leader, your managing director, in terms of what are the kind of laws that we meet, what are the laws that we should comply with, and how should we go about that? Some strategy of that. And compliance is the actual method, actual process of ensuring that you and the employees of the organization, more important, employees of the organization comply with the requirements of the law. Then someone has to review how far are we meeting those laws requirement, how far are we complying with the requirement, and then someone has to report that as to the governing team to come back and say this is the extent of the compliance that we have, and this is what we are complying with, what we are not complying with, and then governing team comes back and tells you as a HR generalist so what to do further. So this is what we mean by the entire regulatory compliance process. Why regulatory compliance? Why should you worry about complying regularly? A stupid question, but let's understand the implications of not complying with the regulatory requirements. See, non-compliance is a huge business risk, and we have seen this happening that if you do not comply with any particular law, whether it is HR or otherwise, you can be asked to shut down the business if it is a persistent non-compliance. So one of the key things in regulatory compliance is to keep tracking which are the laws that you're complying with, which are the laws that you are not complying with, because non-compliance is a huge business risk. It can start with simply getting a notification, then impose the penalty, and if you continue to ignore the penalty, you can be asked to shut down. So compliance of the law is of whatever land that you're operating is very critical because you're dealing with government agencies and their non-compliance means a huge business risk. So what are the regulatory requirements to comply in India? Each country, each land would have its different laws. So, and I will not be able to tell you what are the different laws that are required to be met so far if you are a HR generalist. So you need to figure out locally what are the regulatory requirements that you need. But I should be able to tell you what are some of the common laws that you need to comply in India. So let's take a look at that. So there are many laws. If you look at the regulatory requirement, it can be split into a couple of areas. One is what is called related to wages, the salaries. So there is Code of Wages Salary 2019, which covers Payment of Wages Act, 1936 Minimum Wages Act, Payment of Bonus Act, 1965, and Equal Remuneration Act 1976. So you need to have someone look at all the requirements and tell you how far are you meeting these requirements, and the relevant people in your organization need to be made aware of that. Second thing is the social security area of regulatory compliance. And in this, you have things like Employee Provident Fund, Employee State Insurance Act, Payment of Gratuity Act, and Labor Welfare Act. So you would have to understand these acts and have someone look at, communicate this to the right people and review and report on what is happening. Then if you are a factory, if you are an industrial farm, if you produce, then there are acts like Industrial Disputes Acts of 1947, Industrial Employment Standing Orders Act 1946, Trade Union Act 1926, Factories Act, which is a very widespread, wide spectrum act and very important act to be made for factories in 1948. And there is Shops and Establishment Act that you need to meet. Finally, there are of the recent origin are the women's welfare for women's or benefit for women's. So there is this Equal Remuneration Act that we mentioned earlier, Maternity Benefit Act 1961, Sexual Harassment Act for Women at Workplace, Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal Act, formed as early as late as 2013. So these are a variety of acts, some examples of the various regulatory laws that you would need to consider in meeting and complying with that. So having looked at the first two questions, what is regulatory compliance and what are some of the acts that you need to be aware of, what do we do next? So in the next one, we will look at how to meet these regulatory compliance. As an HR generalist, what can you do to excellently meet these regulatory compliance? So thank you so much for watching this first lecture of regulatory compliance module. I hope you're beginning to learn something new again, beginning to enjoy, and I do look forward to see you again in the next lecture.